The traders included Arabs, Moors, and also there were local because of this connection with the Islamic world. There were local Muslims also. There were, and the kings were having kind of a broad-mindedness in terms of with other religions. So there were Jews settled in the Malabar coast. There were Syrians. So the Syria had a lot of Christians. So the Christians from Syrian connection, there were enough Christians settled in Malabar coast, and there were enough Muslims also. Overall, that inherent intolerance and religious fanaticism of the Portuguese has been also been shown. Not as much it was in Goa, because they didn't get opportunity here to show it as much, because they really didn't have much power here. Namaste, everyone. As she told, my talk today is about the Portuguese, the so-called Portuguese invasion of Malabar. So, from the European point of view, almost all the Western historians have been glorifying the Portuguese in India as a great empire. But the one of the important authority of this topic in India has been Sri K.M. Panikkar, the great, famous Indian historian K.M. Panikkar, who had written a book about this topic of Portuguese in Malabar. So Malabar means the current day Kerala, and basically Portuguese never could really have any power there. They terrorized the seas. They tried to meddle with the political affairs of the land. They did a lot of piracy. They did a lot of terrorist activity, we call that. And then they vanished. They had to vanish. That's the basic gist of the Portuguese episode in Malabar. But it did make a profound change in the landscape and political and the religious landscape of and social landscape of Malabar, and how we know it now as Kerala. So, to start with my talk, first let me explain why the Portuguese or the Europeans desperately wanted to come to India or find a direct route to India. So for time immemorial, from kind of even the beginning of history, we may say, as in normal, so popular parlance, the western coast of India has been a very thriving trading. Always, or along the western coast of India, there have been thriving trading centers which were well connected with the Western world as it was known at that time through the sea trade through the Persian Gulf to the mainland Eurasia, and through that to the Roman Empire, and that means current Europe also. And that trade was controlled by the merchants, rich merchants of Venice, and the Arabs. So from 8th century onwards, the Islam started. Islam became the main face of the Arabs. But so this narrow Red Sea to the Mediterranean, that route to India through the Arabian Sea has been controlled by the Arabs in general. And from the Western European point of view, when we look, they didn't have any direct link to the products which were coming from the East. And these products were of very high value there. It was kind of a fancy, luxury products. And those products, one of the main ingredient of that product was the black pepper, which was called as black gold for a long time. And the Arabs were also making it so enigmatic that and that increased the value of products like the cinnamon. They were telling that cinnamon has been collected from a bird's nest by putting some fire on the nest. The collection process, they made it's so total bunkum, but they made it a big thing. So overall, they sold the products for high price in the Europe. So by the time of this, by the end of after these crusades and by the end of Dark Ages, Western Europeans, the Christian countries, also got a lot of information regarding the eastern part of the world as we knew at that time. So there was an intent desire to find a direct sea link, a route directly connecting Western European country to the Malabar coast or the western coast of India. So this, even us as Indians have been studying in our history book everything from the perspective of the Western Europeans, that finding discovered the sea route to India. It's not that India was an unknown place, or India, there wasn't no sea route to India. There have been always a sea link from the Western world to India, but it was through the Mediterranean Sea, Red Sea, and to the Arabian Sea. And then through land, there was a connection, always connected, but then the Islamic invasions happened, the Turkish invasions happened to India, and that route has become turbulent also, and it isn't so easy as the route through the Arabian Sea. So from the Crusaders, and then later the maps of the Marco Polo's maps, all these which they accumulated and did a lot of research. The Portuguese, one Portuguese person even traveled to Eden, the northern tip in the northwest eastern tip of Africa, and then from there in a merchant ship, which the regular merchant ships were going, Arabs and Jews and others. From a ship in a merchant ship, he reached even Kannur in Kerala. So they got basic informations, and then Bartholomew Dias from Portuguese traveled till the Cape of Good Hope. So, and collected a lot of information from there. And all, they have met people who have been to Kerala or been to the western coast of India. So they got a lot of information, and using all this information, Vasco da Gama charted the journey towards India. And once he reached the Cape of Good Hope, and near that he even got advice from some local kings that it is best to go to Kozhikode or Calicut, because that is the thriving city you will get pepper very well. That's the place of the best trade. So go there. That's how he set his charts towards Calicut, and he reached Calicut. So as it isn't that he did a very, brave kind of a charting the uncharted waters, or he was completely, in dark and like Columbus. He just went to a different direction and reached America. So he did find something. Vasco da Gama actually didn't find anything. He only reached to a place which was known already, and they desperately wanted to reach. That's one background. And another is the scenario, what was the existing scenario in Malabar, in Kerala. So the Kerala as Malabar coast at that time wasn't like how we know it now. Means the India in general was majority area have been under Islamic control, and then came the Vijayanagara Empire. Vijayanagara Empire almost extended across the South India. So the northern part of Kerala and the very bottom south part of Kerala had been kind of under the control of Vijayanagara. Then, but not much. Current Kerala, if you see, not much. Only at both tips, maybe, if you say. But the most important power in Kerala was the Samudiri the Samarin of Calicut. And Calicut has been a very cosmopolitan, very important, rich trading port city with traders from Arabian countries, from Tunisia to from Tunisia onwards, there were, and Tunisia, Morocco, and all were under Muslim Arab control at that time, the Moors. And from there onwards, there were merchant ships merchants, and there were Jew merchants and Indian merchants also, and Syrian merchants. So it was a very thriving country, and because of and the king was also very powerful. He had an effective control till Kannur to Kochi, and there were minor vassals around. Then there was Kannur, which was ruled by Kolatiri, and then Kochi. The Kochi kingdom wasn't as powerful at that time. And then the Venad kingdom, which was had Kollam or Koilon as their headquarters. And then in between, there were other small chiefs. But most of the small chiefs had their alliance with the major kings. And only Kolatiri of Kannur, Samudiri of Kozhikode, and the Venad kings were having the actual king, royal rights in terms of the right to wear crown and the right to mint coins, and also to the right to hold the ceremonial umbrella. So that and the Kochi king was kind of the Samudri king has been ascertaining his power on the Kochi king. That has been the ongoing journey. He wasn't as powerful. And then there are minor chiefs, and then the religious affairs or the temples, who had rights over temples, and their local chiefs or local landlords or local leaderships. There were different, authorities for the various temples and all. They had the religious rights in. So the king didn't completely having that kind of a power. King was more having the political power, as we say. So that kind of but in essence, this Malabar has been fragmented into several principalities, which were trying to, grow, conquer and grow. So but Kannur had a trade with Gujarat and also to other Arabian area. And so basically, even though the politically many kings were weak, they all had airports, they all had some trade with the other part of the world. So this Malabar was very well connected with the then and all the countries known in that time, thriving places. Only that the Western Europe was totally in dark of anything else in the world. That was the situation. Then and also this traders. The traders included Arabs, Moors, and also there were local because of this connection with the Islamic world. There were local Muslims also. And the kings were having kind of a broad-mindedness in terms of with other religions. So there were Jews settled in the Malabar coast. There were Syrians. So the Syria had a lot of Christians. So the Christians from Syrian connection, there were enough Christians settled in Malabar coast, and there were enough Muslims also. So this was but the majority population has been Hindu, and the Nayars were very martial class, as we know. So the power effectively was within the hands of the local, the Hindus only. And these traders, the other traders from the other religion, they didn't dare to interfere with the politics of the countries. So they just took care of their trade because they had to. They did because as I understand that was because the kings weren't really allowing it. There weren't much opportunity for them to interfere with the politics of the land. And in this scenario is what the Portuguese, the Vasco da Gama reaches Calicut. So already since the Samudri had good connections with the Moors and even the king of Egypt, and he was well connected with the European world in sense of well connected with the people connected to the European world. And Moors have a history with the Iberians. The south of Spain was conquered by Moors and they were controlling it for a while. So there was a traditional rivalry between the Moors and the Portuguese or Spaniards. Both were same at that time, kind of. And the Samudri, king of Calicut, became very well informed about the Portuguese from the Moors, the reality of Portuguese, how they are actually. So he didn't accept them, although he showed his hospitality and he welcomed Gama with a very nicely. He wasn't really ready to fell or over his heels to agree with all the terms of Portuguese. So what Portuguese wanted was they wanted a complete monopoly in the trade. They wanted to buy the products, the spices and all at their terms. But the basic normal situation setup existing system was to auction. And the one who is giving the highest bid would get the product. That has been the handling, the business trade custom there. And Portuguese wasn't ready to give the highest price. And so the ones who gave the highest price got the product, but the Portuguese wanted the product. So what happens? They wanted to get rid of the Arabs. And also they were sitting with rivalry with Moors. So they knew the Muslims, they knew how they are, and they had a history. So the enmity already existed. So it was without any provocation itself, the Portuguese started, and also they are basically inherently having this pirate attitude, as we say. So they started attacking. And the Calicut port was very much famous for the security and justice it was ensuring. That is also was a reason why and in India, basically the other part of India was so turbulent. So basically, this area being peaceful also increased the value of the port. So more merchants were coming, more ships were coming. So this Portuguese set fire to the Arabian ships. That they thought they will plunder the products from the sea. Because and also they had kind of a suspicion. They were always suspecting others of intriguing against them, or like kind of a paranoia. They felt the Samudri king is not giving them enough things as they want, is because they have some extra connection with the Arabs or what. But actual reason was one thing: most of the products Portuguese brought to sell in Calicut wasn't of any value for the people of Calicut, because but the products from the Malabar, the spices and all ways of high value, they desperately wanted it, the Portuguese. So the Samudiris, the king, they insisted on paying cash also, basically. But the Portuguese wasn't ready because they didn't have that much cash to give. So there was that kind of clash of interest. Then at that time this guy this Gama couldn't sell all what he brought to Calicut. So he wanted to store it somewhere and asked the Samudri permission to store the products somewhere near the port, so that he can go back to Portugal. Then Samudri told, okay, you can store it, but you should pay customs for the goods you store. That's the rule of the port. Then this Portuguese wasn't ready. Means basically they weren't ready to follow the rules of the land. They wanted the trade in their under their condition. So that all irked the Samudri, and so there was attacks, and then Vasco da Gama left, and that time the Kolathiri of Kannur invited him and told, you can trade here, because that's kind of, if that place is not, you are not being able to be there, okay, then come here, we can have business here. They invited. And also there is a rivalry between Kannur and Kozhikode also, because Kozhikode was trying to expand to Kannur, its regions. So that rivalry. And then Vasco da Gama reached back to Portugal, the amount of products he brought there has been 60 times the cost of the expense the king of Portugal had for this expedition for this voyage by Vasco da Gama and his armada. So it was that much profitable. This one trip was that much profitable for the Portuguese. So then, so the king became so enthusiastic, and he sent the next group to Kerala. But then what happened? He lost way. He started off with 33 ships and 1,500 people, but he lost his way and reached Brazil, and that's how they found Brazil, I think. And then somehow after a while he reached Kerala. That was Cabral. And he had no interest in establishing a peaceful relationship with the people of India. So on, each and every different Portuguese admirals or generals, they became viceroy and all that. So the basic nature of them remains that they had no interest in maintaining peace. They had no diplomacy. They didn't want to do business at the terms set by others. That was the basic nature. So definitely conflict comes up. And the local kings, the Indian kings, had no reason to submit to this, because they were already having a thriving trade, and especially the Samudri, he had nothing to really gain. So he really didn't cow down. But the Kochi king, he felt this is a good opportunity, use the help of Portuguese and get, increase his power and conquer the Samudri. The traditional rivalry drove the Kochi king to make alliance with the Portuguese. And the Kochi king was weak also, so Portuguese could play him, and by fooling him, they could make a fort in Kochi, establish a fort in Kochi, and unlike Calicut, the Kochi was a bit more easier for Portuguese to maintain, because it was surrounded by water. So the attack from the land wasn't as strong, which could have happened as it was in Calicut. And also but even there, they did play their part of, in interfering in the politics of the land. And then, and meanwhile, so the basic reason why Portuguese was not following any rules on the sea. So they were indulging in regular plunder of the Arabian ships. It became very dreadful for the merchants to really travel through the Arabian Sea also. So why Portuguese were behaving like that? It was because they believed. So according to the Portuguese writer Barrow, he says that they believe that the rules are valid only in the European seas. So it was between the European countries the rules were valid. And Portuguese being the first to come through this waters, from their point, the first Europeans to come through these waters, they have the right. So they didn't need to, and the others, the non-Christian Europeans, non-European, non-Christians, don't have any rights. They are not, their rules, their rights are not valid. So why should they follow these kind of, why should Portuguese actually heed to the decorum maintain should demanded by this area land? So that was their logic from their point of view, from a European supremacist point of view. They are justified. So they don't consider themselves as pirates, but they consider these other Arabs and the Moorish ships which attacked, or the Nayars who attacked the Portuguese, as the barbarians and pirates. But on the other hand, the Nayars of the Malabar have been considering the Portuguese as a bunch of holy barbarians who came with having no code of conduct, knowing no way of behavior. That's all about the perspective. So, so the turbulence continued. The Kannur, for a while, the Kannur king Kannur king allowed these people to, do their trade there. And Kochi, they got really good footage. They could build a fort. And also the Queen of Kollam, the Wayanad kingdom, they also got into treaties with them. And in the treaties, they formed with the Kochi and the Wayanad and all there. The major Wayanad, I'll say after. The Kochi, the treaty they made was that the Portuguese should get the complete monopoly over the trade of all the spices, and it should be traded in a price fixed by the Portuguese, and they should be allowed to establish a factory. And then they got that, they got it all. And later on in Wayanad, when they entered into alliance, they similar terms and conditions they gave, and in return, the king of Wayanad's one provision was not to indulge in cow slaughter, not to kill cows. One of the important terms of the Wayanad of the Kollam queen with the Portuguese was not to kill cows, which is a very important point, I think, because how much there existed a reverence for cows in Malabar, that we can notice from that. So, but that there in Kollam, not just in Kollam, overall, that inherent intolerance and the religious fanaticism of the Portuguese has been also been shown. Not as much it was in Goa, because they didn't get opportunity here to show it as much, because they really didn't have much power here. So, once they burned down, so they were, whenever they did any kind of attacks over the Hindu sacred, or not just attacking temple or anything, or even just showing some bigotry, they got retaliated by the locals. That was their local mobs attacking them, or local, as I told, the kings were in the absolute power in Malabar. So the locals did attack them. So there were many such incidents. And one such incident in Kollam, actually the local people set fire to the And also when these Portuguese were attacking the Arab ships or the other ships, in also there were retaliation by the local Nayars as well as the Arabs. And in Kollam, the Portuguese settlement was set in fire by the locals. And using this opportunity by guilt tripping the king of Wayanad, the current Travancore, earlier it was smaller and called Wayanad, they got the right to build a fort there in Kollam. That is how they actually established a fort. That was, they used the opportunity to build a fort because they had ambitions. They weren't just for trade. So, because the primary objective of the Europeans were extending their religious might. So the Pope already had given them the power to establish the kingdom of Christ wherever they go and take the complete authority, the power, sovereignty of the lands they discover. So then there was a law. So the Portuguese kept fighting with Samudri and helping supporting the Kochi, supporting the Kannur and all. So then when this in one of the most intelligent Portuguese leader who came was known as, his name is Albuquerque. So he's the one who actually in Goa also, those who know about Goa will know about him. So he recognized that actually, in effect, the fight between Portuguese and Samudri is not in the interest of Portuguese. It's actually in the interest of Kannur and Kochi. So making peace with Samudri may help Portuguese in gaining the trade, increasing their trade and in their trade. So he did want to make peace with the Samudri. But none of this didn't last much because there were always, violence of Portuguese towards the other traders and all everything. So which ended up in antagonizing the kings. And so in around by the end of 16th century, by getting the Samudri was successful in defeating the Portuguese. That's the gist of the timeline of the story. That Samudri has been successful. That we have to note down, because overall in the general narrative, which is from the perspective of this Eurocentric perspective, the narrative is always that the Portuguese established a vast empire and he defeated the local kings and all. But no, they did have power only in Goa. And in Kerala or in Malabar, they couldn't really have the actual power. They did have power only in those forts they built. That was only a handful of forts. And those forts also they lost eventually. And Samudri continued, although weakened after these 100 years of wars. All the Kerala's, Kochi became more powerful. So the Kerala's political scenario changed in that sense. But Portuguese was defeated by Samudris. That is the actual outcome of this episode. So this is the basic political, timeline. Now I would like to talk about the religious policy of Portuguese, which I think is more important to discuss. So as I told, they were guided with the missionary seal. They were assigned, the rights for conversion of the heathens, and having been, ascertaining their sovereignty over the new land has been bestowed over to them by the Pope, Pope himself. And So they came. So that is why, in general, it is said about the Portuguese that they came with a cross on one hand and sword on the other hand. And but in Kerala, when they came, they really had no idea about the Hindus. They didn't have any idea about Hinduism. And they were, but they knew the Islam, they knew Judaism, they knew. So they then, so they immediately they had no second thought. They had started fighting with the Arabs, the Muslims, with a severe enmity, which they really had from their history. But about Hindus, they didn't have much idea. They thought it's some kind of Eastern Christianity. Seeing it's, I don't know how much true it is, but it is said that Gama, first when he came, he even worshipped in a Devi temple, thinking that the Devi's Murti is some kind of a Eastern native version of this Virgin Mary. And later on, how the time they understood all this, and this, I think during the time when Govan Inquisition and all happened, that is when it became really the policy, of getting the heathens completely into their fold, not completely, destroying the temples and everything. So, but by the time here in Kerala, they didn't have that much of a power. Wherever they could, they did embark violence. And but there were incidents of Portuguese people showing their bigotry in on individuals and individual temples. They had set fire one Tevalakara temple and Palluruthi in near Kochi. They totally plundered and destroyed temple. And also temples were having enough lot of wealth within them. So they had two reasons for destroying the temples, that the wealth as well as the religious bigotry. And they also, so I interestingly read in a book about in Kannur. So there was in Kannur in a temple. There, the adhikari or the person who has the right of the temple, so the son of that family has been abducted by the Portuguese, and the mother prayed, and the Portuguese brought him back. Not Portuguese. Not Portuguese brought him back. From the Portuguese, this person, the Poduval, has been released with his chains into the temple. It's power of the Devi maybe, and still in Teyyam, they during the Teyyam time they tell the story. So that gives a snippet on that there have been incidents, and in also in Calicut, around in Kolatiri, Kannur, and also in Kochi, in Kollam. Overall, there were incidents of them attacking. Like in Kochi, they attacked, one Portuguese guy killed the peacock, considered very holy in the temple peacock. And the king was so angry. Although the king was so weak in Kochi, it was kind of a puppet of the Portuguese. Still, the king became angry, and he reacted very fiercely against this incident. And also the Jews of Kerala. Jews were settled in Kodungalur, which is known as ancient Musuris. So the Portuguese set the Kodungalur completely into fire, and the Jews had to flee from there to Kochi. And the king of Kochi protected them. Although the Portuguese used to kept on persecuting the Jews, but under the support of the king, they could survive there, which they even now acknowledge, the Jews of Kochi. Then the missionary activities of Francis Xavier. He had done his missionary work in the southern part of the Kanyakumari area, and has converted a lot of fishermen folks. And that actually led, and the king was so generous in that terms. King didn't really go against it, the king of Wayanad, and that actually led and also king of Wayanad already was having fights with Vijayanagara, the Naiks, and one attack, one fight between Vijayanagara and Wayanad has been because of this uncontrolled conversion activities of the fishermen folks in the Kanyakumari area. That is why the Vijayanagara ruler came to attack Wayanad. But on the other hand, Goa was given to Portuguese by the Vijayanagara. So we cannot, overall when we look, we'll see that everyone keep on blaming that the Kerala kings opened the doors for conversion, they allowed, and Vijayanagara king came and taught him a lesson. But this was, the conversion activities was happening on, that was there, that is a fact. Vijayanagara king came and taught a lesson. But on the other hand, because this is all more than 100 years, it all went, the story. So each individual have different behavior. Each king have his different priorities and different behavior. That also happened. So the Vijayanagara kingdom, they wanted a port without Islamic influence, and they wanted so they thought, okay, if this Portuguese is maintaining this place, and if they are getting this Bahmanis out of the area, and if they can get this horses were very important, and horses imported to the Goa was very useful for the Vijayanagara. So what the value of that horses, they gave considering the value of the horse, they felt this small place, Portuguese controlling this small place is nothing. Same is what Portuguese thought about the Hindus in Kerala. The value of the spices, value of the trade they wanted to accomplish through these Hindu kingdoms were higher than their religious ideology. So they didn't really went completely against the Hindus of Kerala because they needed the spices, the products. So the trade interest became superior. Same for the Vijayanagara. So me personally, if I say, I really don't agree with the many people who completely put the blame on the Kerala kings for, for their trade behaviors, their benevolent nature towards other religion, and how they allowed Arabs to have trade there, and how they allowed Francis Xavier and other missionaries to convert the people. If we blame like that, we have to blame the beloved Vijayanagara also. And also we have to blame, but I don't agree with that trend of blaming the local kings and local, the rulers for whatever happened due to the presence of the unknown foreigners. The behavior pattern of the foreigners were always like with bigotry. But to defeat the greater enemy, they went to the smaller enemy. They thought that is a smaller enemy, But later on, when it became too much in the Inquisition of Goa and all became too much, the Vijayanagara kings retaliated. When in Kanchipuram, the Portuguese planned to destroy the Kanchipuram temple, and also they destroyed the Mylapore temple. That is when the Vijayanagara kings tried to, went and attacked Portuguese. Also, they came to attack Wayanad. So you cannot always perceive the danger beforehand. Sometimes you have to face it, and then only you will understand, then you have to retaliate. So I think the same parameters should be applied to the kings of Kerala also, because they also the Samudri, for example, so much underestimated, undervalued, and demeaned by even mainly by the right also, to be honest, because he had Muslims in his service, and he had and now there is a lot of Muslims in that area. That isn't the parameter. So, for example, the Kunyali Marakkar, another one figure in this epoch of Portuguese and Malabar history. So Kunyali Marakkar, this Marakkar family was a rich merchant family of Kochi kingdom. They had a big, were attacked because of the Portuguese attacks. They came towards Calicut and Kozhikode, Samudiri's kingdom, and Samudiri. Then onwards, they started to help Samudiri, and they had a fort in Ponnani. Two generation went like that. They did fight against the Portuguese, implemented guerrilla warfare against Portuguese, and was a nightmare for Portuguese. Did really help a lot. Not because they wanted to help the Samudiri, but for their business interests. They wanted to maintain their business. For that, they need peace in Arabian Sea. So that is the basic reason. But in effect, that was in service of Samudri, because Samudri also wanted to get rid of Portuguese, and he also wanted peace in the Arabian Sea and get more ships coming from Arabia to Calicut. So the interest matched. So the Marakkar became the naval captain of Samudri again, and it all went well. But the next Marakkar became so haughty and arrogant. He thought all this is because of him. And he even started to disregard Samudri's power. And one incident is that he cut the tail of the elephant of a powerful Nayar. And then Samudri conspired with the Portuguese and gave Kunyali to Portuguese, and Portuguese executed Kunyali. So, how can we blame Samudri completely for what? Even for the treachery of Kunyali, we cannot blame Samudri. Samudri did act. And we cannot connect all this with what happened later, like in Tipu's invasion and all, Hyder Ali and all. But that is what is happening. Out of the, not getting, so I don't know what is the hatred, but there is some kind of a focused narrative building which brings that time the Hindus of Kerala failed. That is why Kerala is now having a lot of Christian and Muslim population. But if you see overall India, that is the situation. So how we failed, that we cannot judge like that, the history. So Samudri, if we come again, because through this research for this, in this topic, where I also got to gain more respect for Samudri in the sense that he recognized the power, what superiority Portuguese have in the warfare or whatever, and he tried to fill that gap in his army. He employed some Italians to teach better artillery warfare. No, not artillery warfare, what we call infantry. So with gun, the warfare with guns, and also the making their naval fleet more advanced according to the standards of the which can withstand the Portuguese power. So he even wrote to the king of Egypt to attack the Portuguese. So because the entire Arabian Sea, if you see, the king of Egypt also at that time was powerful. So if he could, they also attack the Portuguese. So he tried to make alliances, even wrote to Bahmanis. So tried to build alliances to get rid of the Portuguese menace. Portuguese was kind of a menace only. We cannot really say a naval power, superior. And even when better powerful, better, more cunning. powers from the Western Europe reached here, Portuguese power also went away. The Dutch is more cunning than Portuguese. To be honest, to an extent, Portuguese has been very open. They showed their bigotry very openly. So it was easy to attack them, to resist them. But the Dutch were a bit more cunning, and then came the British, and the sea, the Arabian Sea or the Indian Ocean area became kind of a battleground of these powers. That was the later situation. These three have started fighting. So because of the other European powers also, Portuguese lost its power. So with all these, so the land they couldn't conquer because of the land powers, the rulers of Kerala. The sea they lost because of the other European powers coming into the sea. And so that is the, so then another one episode is the native Christians in Kerala. So the native Christians in Kerala were basically from the Syrian descent. They were under the church from Basra in Syria. The Patriarch of Antioch, where they were under him. And then when the Portuguese came, the Christian community in Kerala, they were a small community. They went to the Portuguese. They were around Kodungalur and Angamali, basically in Kodungalur area mainly. They went to the Portuguese and submitted to them, to the Portuguese. They surrendered their privileges and pledged to the Portuguese that they will conduct their affairs only in the name of the Portuguese king. And they even suggested them that the Gama should conquer the Hindu kingdoms, and even suggested that the idea of building a fort in Kodungalur also was given by these Christians. But little did they know what would be happening to them in future. So the biggest story of religious persecution by Portuguese in Kerala is the persecution of native Christians or the Syrian Christians by the Portuguese. So the Portuguese forts were like only Christians were allowed to be in the fort. And outside the fort, they had no power. The Portuguese had no power. So inside the Portuguese fort, Christians got privileges, they got land, and they could stay there. So these native Christians all were good in the beginning. But later, when this Bishop Meneses came, so there were a schism, and they wanted, Portuguese wanted all these Christians to come under the Latin control, under the control of the Roman Catholic Church. But these Syrian Christians were following Syrian liturgy, and they were having, they were under the Orthodox in Syrian Church. So some refused, and there was a revolt, kind of. The Portuguese, before that, had a synod in Diamper, Synod of Diamper, it is called. It's a place in Udayamperur near Kochi. So there, in that synod, they decreed that to change the various ways of the Syrian Christians. The Latin Church, the Roman Catholic Church bishop, they had a bishop in Kochi, and then the Syrian Christians, those who refused to join the Roman Catholic Church, they all came together in Mattancherry and on a cross. They tied a rope on a cross and held that rope and pledged that they will only they have their allegiance towards the bishop and the patriarch, Mepran, or they sent from the Syria. And it says that the bishop who was sent from there never reached Kerala because the Portuguese killed them in the sea, killed him in the sea. Anyway, this is the beginning of the division of Kerala Church also. And these Christians were persecuted a lot by the Portuguese. And so these are and there is another interest. The local kings actually played the Portuguese a lot. Like, for example, the king of Tanur, he agreed to convert because the Portuguese thought they could convert some of the kings. They tried their best. The other kings, they couldn't really, but the king of Tanur agreed to convert. According to Panikar, the king of his Vettatanadu king, he went to even Goa with the Portuguese. He converted, but once he came back, he wasn't there. He did dare to agree that he converted, and he behaved as if he didn't, and he continued his ways, and he even joined Samudri to attack Portuguese. And then there was another king. He was the king of actually the Arayan caste, which is a fisherman caste in my understanding. So the Purakkad is a famous coastal place in Kerala, which had an Araya king. And he was very wealthy because of the trade and everything. And this king was first with the Portuguese, but during the war between Samudri, the Portuguese people wounded him. That enraged him, and that he went back, joined the Samudri again. And this treachery actually costed the Portuguese the important base Charlium Fort, which ended the Portuguese hegemony in any kind of power in Kerala.
So, ma'am, the first thing I wanted to ask was this Cabral. Did he come after Da Gama left, or was it when Vasco was still in Malabar?
I think he came after the Gama left, because first the Gama's voyage was kind of a trial.
Okay.
Like they weren't sure what would be the outcome. Once Gama came with enormous amount of riches, the king became confident. That's how that's when he decided to continue this process, because and he got more money also.
So this tirade seems to be between the Zamorins, the Miris, and and Cabral and his forces, right? So what was the like you said that the king of Kochi or the Raja of Kochi, he was a very weak puppet. Was it like that throughout, or was it when the Portuguese had made their influence? And second of all, was this Raja of Kochi sort of a representative of the Vijayanagara Empire? So I wanted to know what Raja of Kochi.
No, Raja of Kochi wasn't representative of Vijayanagara Empire. But the thing is, Samudri had more. I told that the local vassal chiefs, the Nayar chiefs like Anji Kaimal, so there are Kaimal, and in Paravur there is a Nambudiri chief. The local chiefs who they all were Idapalli. They all were having allegiance to Samudri. And the history before is also, there have been fights, there's Chavers. So it wasn't like a direct warfare. Every chiefs had their own warriors, Nayar warriors then they go and fight against as representing the king. That kind of warfare was it. But Samudri grew in power after 12th century onwards. Samudri grew in power. Then Kochi was surrounded by the local chiefs loyal to Samudri. So Kochi didn't have much. Although Kochi king is Kshatriya and Samudri is Nayar in caste. But Kochi didn't have enough land. Kochi didn't have enough chiefs, local chiefs who were allegiant to them. So Kochi was kind of, although they were and so that all added up, and also they didn't have ceremonial powers, lot of ceremonial powers also. Samudri, Kolatiri, and the Venad were having the most power at that time.
one last question, ma'am, that the Miris had started sending out cows for slaughter. So that was something that the king did not like. And so the Portuguese helped save the cows, and then later on they executed many Arab people Arab traders who used to smuggle cows for slaughter. But in the same vein, the Portuguese used to. I mean, there is this very famous story when Vasco had this disdain for Hindus, so he had cut the lips and the ears off a Hindu, and he had sent it he had sent it back to wherever he came from. So, how did the king sort of deal with both evils? Because both of them seem to be very barbaric in their nature.
So Arabs, basically, what I understand, there were these in the coastal areas, this kind of, and that one aspect which I don't, I got to try to find out more about it in many books and all, but I couldn't find a lot. And I assume that the Arabs were kind of a middleman of the slave trade also. Mm. Yeah, so there were that kind of, but from a king's point of view, lot of things they will just they also would ignore if it is not affecting any, even in current politicians when political leaders point of view also, we look, the rulers usually ignore if the loss is for some insignificant people, or if it is not very, if if Ambani gets some disadvantage, then the whole country may feel it. Like the COVID came in Europe, because of which it became a big thing. Likewise, so I think some things, I think the kings also might not, and there were enough corruption everywhere there was. Here also in this Portuguese story also we can see, bribing somebody and getting, local people, lower people, or even kings were bribed. That kind of things might have happened. And Portuguese also were, but I think Arabs, the traders were of a different nature, and this kind of slave trade and all that, and also the parameters of that time was different, no? And about cow smuggling, I don't know well about it. What I have understood about the cow slaughter history in Kerala is that beef or cow meat, Muslims generally didn't dare to violate the rules in that time. They also, because cow slaughter really had a capital punishment. So that wasn't a lot of a big issue until this large scale of conversions happened, and the clear cut, desecrating the heathen symbols, and so in Goa Inquisition also happened at that time, where it became the policy of the Portuguese, from the Portuguese king's order itself, it became a policy to not allow any heathen symbols to stay on the ground. That you should raise everything onto the ground. You should destroy all the symbols, all the ways of heathen lifestyle. Even the Syrian Christians got in trouble for following a lot of the ways of lifestyle which the Catholic Church considered as heathenish. So I read somewhere that the Archbishop Meneses decreed that eating cow meat is a religious obligation of the Christians. So when that outright desecration became the zeal, and you want to prove yourself as a good religious adherent of the religion by completely, going against, being so puritanical, so bigot, that is when absolute violence happens against the other religion. And I think the Portuguese approach had a big role in that, because the conversion, the parayas, fishermen folks converted in the south, in the Nanjil Nadu, in the Kanyakumari area, they even became the soldiers of Portuguese in trying to conquering the Ceylon. And then Sri Lanka, the 400 parayas in boats were killed by the Sri Lankans according to the Sri Lankan legends. So that much zeal, loyalty they got because of the power of the religion only. Just without losing the religion, without going to that other religion, they would not have been that loyal actually, So I think with the Muslims also, with the Amoors also, that might be the thing. And basically, the cow meat is more, the killing cows was more of an act of desecration or attacking the Hindus rather than the delicacy or eating it as a food, as it is portrayed now.
What is the precise role of Francis Xavier in Kerala as opposed to Goa?
In Kerala, in general, Francis Xavier is the missionary who established, who was the, who led the missionary activities, because Portuguese setup basically was that the soldiers weren't paid. After 1 year of service, only the soldiers could get paid. They were all but the missionaries were highly paid. They were having enough money. So they had more power. And the church had more power on. So that was there. But then still there was enough corruption among the Portuguese rank. Even there were Portuguese who spied for Samudri. That level of corruption were there. And Francis Xavier came, and he was kind of a puritanical. He was simple. He walked around. He was that ideal missionary, what is depicted as the pious missionary monk. So he had more control over the narrative, over the Portuguese, and his activities were in the south of Kerala. There he went along the coastal areas. Few Nayars might have been converted, but mainly the fishermen folks. But then this Vijayanagara attacked Venad. So there were wars and in general, he didn't accomplish beyond that. He did try to help the ruler and all that, but in general, he didn't accomplish much. Then he went to Japan. And in Japan also, the experience of the missionaries weren't nice at all. Then I think maybe that is why he came back out. But he got really successful in Goa. So Goa he ruled. But he is the pioneer among the missionaries who really had who really preached things like revolutionary things, you can say, like everything was in corruption and all that. He preached piety. He was more had a puritanical zeal. And he did work hard in the sense that he didn't know Malayalam, but the people talk Malayalam. And then he got somebody to translate this. So he translated the entire catechism into Malayalam and learned everything by heart and started preaching loud and loud. And also but above all, the basic one advantage the converts had was they had privileges in the Portuguese, and where Portuguese were having power. So in the fort area, they got land. So basic material benefit in the sense. But the narrative comes that the caste oppression is the reason for conversion and everything. And that is why lower caste people converted. But I think more than that is not, I don't think for the fisher folk that could have been a reason, because fisher folk were separate entities. And even I told that Araya king of Purakkad, so that means they have their kings and everything. So discrimination, how much they will go and mingle with somebody in the hills, I don't know, because their business is in the sea mainly. but maybe instigating some kind of shame, then he might have succeeded. But in general, I think the violence had its place. Kind of, if one set of people converted, then more people came. They get more number of people to attack the other ones who are not. And also these techniques, but there are enough stories spreading around that Francis Assisi showed his cross or something, and the Vijayanagara army fled away and that kind of. I think that in my experience, I think these kind of stories are basically very usual narrative built by the Christians to keep their, that any saints, if you see, you will hear stories of miracles. Many of the miracles are we cannot really think that it is actually what happened. Some might be exaggerated. So, but here in Kerala, that southern part is where Francis Xavier really had some conversion activities. But overall, when I look wherever, because consolidated accounts we don't find anywhere. If we look about Francis Xavier, we find most of the accounts are from the Christians. That definitely we cannot take completely as true, because this miracle aspect and everything, we cannot take it as historical facts. And then when we look at the historians, there are enough stories showing that wherever any kind of attack or respect to the temples or Hindu sacred happens, local Nair forces or local people did retaliate. So the fisher folks, the conversion of the fisher folks was was a tremendous process, basically. Did translate everything into Malayalam, and then he did work there, but Goa was more violent.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the second question is, were there any political calculations that made the Syrian community declare for the Portuguese, or is it an entirely theological idea that they are Christians and we should be joining them too?
One is blood is thicker than like the thing. Like when say they are of our God, we both share the same God. So there was a political interest, I am sure. Otherwise, if there was no political interest, they would not have asked the Portuguese to attack the Hindu king. So, and same with when the Hyder Ali came, the local Muslims of Calicut went to Hyder Ali. Till then they were loyal to the Zamorins. Till then the Muslims were loyal, better behaved to Samarin than the Christians. So with the experience. But the thing is, when the compatriots came, the colors showed up. Till then they stayed low. Because that means they were well behaved and they were nice because they had no choice. They weren't powerful, and the kings were generous. That is true in general, but Hindus in general don't consider people of other religion as somebody who should not live here or who don't have the right to exist. That Hindus in general don't consider. So the kings were also like that. They felt, okay, as long as they don't interfere in our business, let them live there. And Syrians, basically, a lot of Syrians came and settled as refugees when Islam conquered their lands in Syria. So, and Jews also. So far, Jews were the ones who didn't really be so treacherous because they anyway had no power either. So, I mean, they got powerful only now in history if we look. So I think it is political interest comes in when you understand that there is a chance of showing power. Where there is a chance of victory, you will show your power. Till then, you'll stay low because if I should be suicidal. And I mean, that's what I understand.
Okay. And I think you just mentioned something related to my third issue, which is that there are very few, if any, native accounts of the Portuguese activities in the Malabar. And most of the data is obtained from Christian sources, which are obviously partisan, right? So does that not say something about the society in general and its lack of inquiry, its lack of curiosity, which
Not
is
really.
not unique to
No.
Kerala?
No, native account I meant is not native, not native account. I meant is, if we look in English, I mean, in Malayalam, if we search, old books and all, I got some infos from Malayalam, one book about Teyyam I got an info. So we need to, there is an active effort to compile everything. See, K.M. Panikkar wrote a book about Portuguese in Malabar, which is actually the authoritative, in my opinion, that's the authoritative book, because he really did an effort to compile all the information and put it as much as possible. And it is from the perspective of a Indian. But Francis Assisi, that part he didn't go very critically in his book. And also these stories of Wayanad attacking and all that is not in his book. The Wayanad attack I got from Sridhara Menon. And also when I searched, it's filled with the Christian accounts.
Exactly.
In English and also academic. So current academic accounts doesn't indicate lack of curiosity and everything in our ancestors. It indicates lack of curiosity and lack of integrity in our current generation, who don't really try to explore and find out the facts from our perspective. They all are happy with parroting what was told by the Westerners. And our history textbooks and historians, in general, quote only the Western sources. The local sources are I don't know why they feel like it's up below standard. See, local people doesn't need to write in English. So local ancestors, Kerala Mahatmyam, Kerala Parama, have accounts of Portuguese. So olden books, Malayalam books are there, but there is no a precise book with a Malayalam book only about Portuguese. Book will be, because why should they write about some barbarians? They don't see that as a significant episode. The Portuguese, the Westerners see that as a significant episode, because of which there is a lot written by them. But for people of the rulers of Malabar in general, when we look, why should they see some random barbaric invaders? Not even invaders, some pirates. From the Malabar point of view, they're just pirates. They some random people came for business, and they indulged in act of piracy. They tried to make other local people fight each other. They tried to convert a lot of people into their religion, but insignificant. Then came the Dutch, even worse. Then came the English, and meanwhile came the Mysore, the Hyder and Tipu. So overall, there are a lot of this kind of turbulence happened compared to all the other turbulence happened in Kerala after that. This was nothing. So why should they invest in this? So there are enough mentions in the contemporary Malayalam books, but how much we will be able to, but then how much we can now get it, all the info, depends on how much somebody, really do some research on this now. And then in internet, I see a lot of blogs, lots of random Christian Malayali guy writing blogs with a lot of stories, which also an attempt to build a lot of antiquity for their family, connecting with St. Thomas and the so-called Brahmin converts. From then onwards, they write all these stories, and also building history. They have a mission in building history. We have a mission in ignoring history. Now, that's the thing.
Just a comment, since she mentioned the book by Sri K.M. Panikkar. It is interesting that though he did make an attempt to get all the Malayali accounts also, he actually dedicates his book to a Portuguese scholar or official, I think, who has helped him a lot in doing research in the Portuguese material. So clearly, there is some kind of asymmetry that we have to remedy. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, but that shows that that shows that K.M. Manikar did refer original sources that make his research more reliable. He did, but how he write, by referring all the sources, how he narrate how the narrative comes. I don't think current so-called academicians will dare to write the episode of Syrian Christians.